The earth trembled as Moses stood before the roaring Red Sea, thousands of desperate Israelites behind him and Pharaoh's bloodthirsty army racing closer by the second. Hearts pounded, fear gripped the people. Was this how their journey would end? Then, in a moment that defied all logic, Moses raised his staff, the winds howled, and the sea itself began to split apart. A path to freedom appeared, but danger was far from over. What happened next would shake the world and prove that when God moves, nothing can stand in his way. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video like this. Your support helps us bring more life-changing stories your way. As you watch, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of Moses' journey impacts you the most. Now, get ready for a story filled with mystery, suspense, and a powerful lesson that will stay with you forever. The hot sun burned down on the land of Egypt. The great Nile River flowed through the kingdom, giving life to the people. But not everyone in Egypt was free. Among the people were the Hebrews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had once been honored guests in Egypt, but over time, a new Pharaoh arose, one who did not remember Joseph and how he had saved Egypt from famine. This Pharaoh was afraid. The Hebrews were growing in number, becoming strong. What if they join our enemies and fight against us? He wondered. Fear turned to cruelty. Pharaoh made them slaves, forcing them to build his cities, carry heavy stones, and work from sunrise to sunset. Still, the Hebrews grew stronger. Pharaoh was furious. If hard work could not stop them, he would do something worse, something wicked. He made a terrible law. Every baby boy born to the Hebrews must be thrown into the Nile River. The Hebrew mothers wept. Fathers held their newborn sons, not knowing what to do. Would their children be taken away? Could anyone stop Pharaoh? In the middle of this terror, a baby boy was born. His mother, Jochebed, looked into his tiny face, and her heart filled with love. She knew at that moment, she would not let Pharaoh take her son. For 3 months, Jochebed hid her baby. She nursed him quietly, rocked him gently, and prayed to God for help. But as he grew, it became harder to keep him hidden. His cries could be heard, and soldiers often passed by their home. One night, Jochebed sat with her husband, Amram, and her daughter, Miriam. "We must do something before the soldiers find him," she whispered. Miriam, a smart and brave young girl, asked, "What can we do, Mama?" Jochebed looked at her baby, then at a basket sitting in the corner of the room. An idea formed in her mind, a dangerous, yet hopeful plan. "I will make a basket," she said. "A strong one, covered with tar so that water cannot get inside. Then, I will place him in the river, among the reeds. Perhaps someone will find him and have mercy on him." Miriam gasped. "But, Mama, the river is dangerous. There are crocodiles. The current is strong." "I know, my child," Jochebed said, tears in her eyes. "But we must trust God. He will protect him." So, that night, she wove a basket out of reeds. She coated it with tar and pitch, making it waterproof. Then, with a heavy heart, she placed her baby inside. The tiny boy, unaware of the danger, slept peacefully. Jochebed whispered a prayer. "O Lord, protect my son. Hide him from Pharaoh's men. Let him live." Miriam volunteered, "I will watch from a distance. I will see what happens to him." With one last kiss on his forehead, Jochebed placed the basket in the river. The current carried it gently among the tall reeds, away from her trembling hands. The basket floated down the Nile, rocking gently with the waves. The water shimmered under the morning sun. Fish swam beneath, and birds called from the trees. Then, footsteps approached the riverbank. Laughter echoed through the air. Pharaoh's daughter had come to bathe. She was surrounded by her maidservants, all dressed in fine linen, their jewelry sparkling in the sunlight. As she stepped into the water, something unusual caught her eye. A basket floating among the reeds. "Bring me that basket," she commanded. One of her servants waded into the water and pulled the basket to shore. Slowly, Pharaoh's daughter lifted the lid. A gasp escaped her lips. Inside was a tiny baby, his cheeks round and soft, his little fists waving in the air. Then, he cried. The princess felt her heart melt. "This must be a Hebrew baby," she murmured, recognizing his features. She knew her father's law. Hebrew baby boys were to be thrown into the Nile. Yet, as she looked at the helpless child, she could not bear to think of such cruelty. "He is so beautiful," she whispered. "I will keep him as my own." Just then, Miriam, who had been hiding in the reeds, stepped forward. She had seen everything, and her heart raced with both fear and excitement. She took a deep breath and bravely spoke. "My lady," she said, bowing, "shall I go and find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you?" The princess smiled. "Yes, that is a good idea. Go and bring her." Miriam ran as fast as her feet could carry her. She burst into their home, breathless. "Mama, come quickly." Jochebed hurried to the river, her heart pounding. Could it be? Was her son still alive? When she arrived, Pharaoh's daughter handed her the baby. "Take this child and nurse him for me," she said, "and I will pay you for your care." Jochebed could hardly believe it. She held her baby in her arms once more, joy and gratitude filling her heart. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. For the next few years, Jochebed cared for her son. She fed him, held him, and taught him about the God of Israel. But as he grew older, the time came to return him to Pharaoh's daughter. She named him Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up in the palace, surrounded by wealth, power, and luxury. He was trained in the wisdom of Egypt, mathematics, reading, writing, and warfare. He ate the finest food and wore the best clothes. He had servants and lived in golden halls. Yet, deep inside, Moses knew he was different. He was not an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. He saw his people suffer under cruel slave masters. He heard their cries as they were beaten. And though he lived as a prince, his heart was troubled. Then, one day, everything changed. Moses was walking among the Hebrew slaves when he saw something that filled him with anger. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew man mercilessly. The slave groaned in pain, falling to the ground. Moses' fists clenched. His heart pounded. He looked around. No one was watching. Without thinking, he rushed forward and struck the Egyptian. The man fell to the ground, motionless, dead. Moses gasped. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He had killed a man. He quickly buried the body in the sand and fled. But the next day, two Hebrews were fighting. Moses tried to stop them. "Why do you fight each other?" he asked. One of them sneered. "Will you kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses' blood ran cold. People knew. And soon, Pharaoh knew. Moses must die, Pharaoh declared. Moses had no choice. He ran. He left behind the palace, the riches, and his royal life. He ran into the wilderness, far from Egypt, far from everything he had ever known. Little did he know, his true journey was just beginning. Moses ran. The golden palaces of Egypt faded behind him. The cries of the Hebrew slaves, the shouts of Egyptian soldiers, all became a distant memory as he entered the wilderness. The desert stretched before him, endless and dry. The sun burned his skin, and the wind whispered through the rocky hills. He walked for days, his feet sore, his heart heavy. He had lost everything. No longer a prince, no longer a hero, he was a fugitive. Finally, he reached Midian, a land far from Pharaoh's reach. One day, as he rested near a well, he saw a group of women struggling. They were trying to water their sheep, but some rough shepherds came and pushed them aside. Moses' heart stirred. He had once tried to help his people. Could he still stand for what was right? He stepped forward. "Leave them alone," he commanded. The shepherds, startled by his strength, backed away. The women, grateful, quickly watered their sheep. "Who are you, stranger?" one of them asked. "My name is Moses," he said. Little did he know, these women were the daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian. When they returned home, they told their father about the brave stranger. "Bring him here," Jethro said. Moses was welcomed into their home. He worked for Jethro, caring for his sheep. Over time, he married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and started a family. Years passed. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, was now a shepherd. He thought his story was over. But God had a different plan. One day, Moses was leading his flock through the mountains when something caught his eye. A bush. It was on fire, but something was strange. The flames burned, but the bush was not turning to ash. Moses took a step closer. This is strange, he thought. Why is the bush not burning up? As he stepped forward, a mighty voice called his name. Moses! Moses! Moses froze. His heart pounded. Here I am, he answered, his voice trembling. Do not come any closer, the voice said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Moses fell to his knees. Who is speaking to me? Then the voice declared, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses covered his face. He dared not look at the burning bush. God spoke again. I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. Now, I have come to deliver them. Moses listened, his breath shallow. Then God said something that made his heart stop. I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh. You will bring my people out of Egypt. Moses' eyes widened. His hands trembled. Me? Go back? Face Pharaoh? Lead a nation? He shook his head. Who am I, Lord, that I should go to Pharaoh? I will be with you, God said. But what if they ask who sent me? Moses asked. God answered, I am who I am. I am. Moses had never heard anything like this. Tell them I am has sent you, God commanded. I will show my power through you. Still, Moses hesitated. But what if they don't believe me? God gave him signs. Throw your staff on the ground, God said. Moses obeyed. The moment his staff hit the ground, it transformed into a snake. Moses jumped back in fear. Pick it up, God commanded. Moses swallowed hard, then reached down. The moment he grabbed the snake's tail, it became a staff again. God gave another sign. Put your hand inside your cloak. Moses did. When he pulled it out, his hand was covered in leprosy, a terrible disease. His skin was white and decayed. Now put it back inside, God said. Moses obeyed. When he pulled his hand out again, it was healed. Still, Moses hesitated. But Lord, I am not a good speaker. Who made man's mouth? God asked. I will help you speak. Moses sighed. Lord, please send someone else. God was patient, but firm. Your brother, Aaron, will help you. But you, Moses, must go. Moses had no more excuses. He took a deep breath, gripped his staff, and made a choice. I will go. Little did he know, he was about to witness the greatest miracles the world had ever seen. Moses took a deep breath as he stood on the edge of Midian, staring toward Egypt. The land he had once called home, the land he had fled in fear, now stood before him again. But this time, he was not alone. Beside him was Aaron, his older brother, whom God had sent to help him. In his hand, Moses held the same wooden staff that had turned into a snake in the wilderness. But now, that staff was more than just a piece of wood. It was a symbol of God's power. With each step toward Egypt, Moses' heart pounded. Would Pharaoh listen? Would the Israelites believe him? What if they still saw him as a failure? But then, deep within his spirit, he heard the voice of God. I will be with you. And so, Moses and Aaron entered the great kingdom of Egypt, walking through its golden streets until they stood before the mighty palace of Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world. Pharaoh sat on his throne, dressed in shimmering robes, a golden crown upon his head. His eyes were cold and cruel as he looked at the two Hebrew men standing before him. Moses took a deep breath and spoke the words God had commanded him to say. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go. The room fell silent. Then Pharaoh laughed. His voice echoed through the halls. Who is this Lord that I should obey him? I do not know him, and I will not let Israel go. Moses' heart sank. But God had already told him, Pharaoh's heart would be stubborn. Instead of freeing the Israelites, Pharaoh made their suffering worse. He forced them to work harder, to make bricks without straw. The people groaned and cried out, blaming Moses for their suffering. Moses fell to his knees that night, crying out to God, "Lord, why have you sent me? The people are suffering even more." But God answered, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. With my mighty hand, I will bring my people out of Egypt." And so, the battle between God and Pharaoh began. Pharaoh's heart was hard. He refused to listen. So, God sent plagues upon Egypt, one after another, each one worse than the last. 1. The Nile turns to blood. Moses struck the river with his staff. The water turned to blood. Fish floated to the surface, dead. The air was thick with the stench. But Pharaoh refused to let the people go. 2. Frogs everywhere. Frogs covered Egypt. They jumped into homes, into ovens, into Pharaoh's own bed. The people screamed as they found frogs in their food, in their clothes, everywhere. Pharaoh begged Moses to pray for the frogs to leave. But once the frogs were gone, he changed his mind. 3. Lice on every person and animal. Moses struck the dust, and lice swarmed over Egypt. The Egyptians scratched and groaned, covered in tiny biting insects. Even Pharaoh's magicians whispered, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh refused to listen. 4. Swarms of flies. Thick clouds of flies filled the air. They covered the ground like a moving, buzzing carpet. They crawled on faces, flew into eyes, and filled the Egyptian homes. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there were no flies. 5. Death of livestock. The cows, sheep, and horses of Egypt fell dead, one by one. But again, Pharaoh's heart was stubborn. 6. Painful boils. Suddenly, painful sores broke out on every Egyptian, boils that burned and oozed. Even Pharaoh's magicians, covered in sores, could not stand before Moses. 7. Fiery hail. A great storm covered Egypt. Hail rained down from the sky, mixed with fire. It destroyed crops, shattered trees, and crushed anything outside. Pharaoh cried out, "I have sinned. I will let your people go." But once the storm stopped, he hardened his heart again. 8. A swarm of locusts. Black clouds of locusts filled the sky, devouring every plant. The land of Egypt became a wasteland. 9. 3 days of darkness. A thick darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so heavy that no one could move. But in Goshen, the Israelites had light. Pharaoh called Moses. "Go, but leave your flocks." Moses shook his head. "We must take everything to worship the Lord." Pharaoh's eyes burned with fury. "Get out. If I see you again, you will die." Moses turned and said, "You are right. You will never see my face again." The final plague was coming, and it would be the most terrifying of all. That night, Moses gathered the Israelites. "The Lord has spoken," he said. "Tonight, the angel of death will pass through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land will die, from Pharaoh's son to the lowest slave. But God has provided a way to save us." Then Moses gave instructions from God. "Take a perfect lamb, kill it, and take its blood. Paint the blood on your doorposts. Stay inside, and do not go out until morning." The people listened. They took their lambs, shed the blood, and covered their doors. At midnight, a terrible cry rose across Egypt. From the grandest palace to the poorest hut, the firstborn in every home was dead, even Pharaoh's own son. But in the houses where the blood of the lamb covered the doors, the angel of death passed over. Pharaoh, broken and afraid, finally gave in. "Go," he whispered. "Leave Egypt. Take your flocks, your families, take everything. Just go." The Israelites had no time to wait. They packed quickly, taking unleavened bread that had no time to rise. They left in the dark of night, a vast nation of people, walking away from slavery into freedom. After 430 years in Egypt, they were free. But the story was not over yet. Pharaoh would change his mind again. And soon, the Israelites would find themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the most powerful army in the world. Would God save them again? The Israelites marched out of Egypt, their hearts racing with excitement. For the first time in 430 years, they were free. No more whips, no more forced labor. The cries of their ancestors were behind them. Men, women, and children walked together, carrying their belongings. Some led donkeys loaded with supplies, while others held their little ones close. The night air was filled with whispers of hope. But Moses knew something the others didn't. Pharaoh's heart was not finished hardening. And soon, he would come after them. Back in Egypt, Pharaoh sat in his darkened palace. His son was dead. His land was destroyed. But as he stared at the empty streets of his kingdom, something twisted inside him. "What have I done?" he growled. "The Israelites were our slaves. Who would build our cities? Who would serve us?" Fury burned in his heart. No, this was not over. Pharaoh leapt to his feet. "Summon my army," he roared. At his command, 600 of Egypt's strongest chariots rolled onto the desert sands, their wheels grinding against the earth. Thousands of soldiers armed with swords and spears followed, their hearts filled with rage. Pharaoh stood tall in his golden chariot, the wind whipping through his hair. "We will bring them back," he sneered. And with that, Egypt's greatest army thundered toward the Israelites. The Israelites had come to the edge of the Red Sea. The water stretched before them, deep, endless, impossible to cross. Moses stood on a rock, looking ahead. "Where do we go from here, Lord?" Then, a rumble shook the ground. A deep, distant sound. The pounding of horses' hooves. The Israelites turned. Dust rose in the distance. Then they saw them, Pharaoh's army, chariots, soldiers, a sea of warriors racing toward them. The people's joy turned to terror. "Moses," they cried, "we're trapped. We're going to die." Some wailed. Others pointed at the sea. "Why did you bring us here? Were there not enough graves in Egypt?" Fear spread like wildfire. But Moses stood firm. His eyes lifted to the heavens. "Lord, what do we do?" Then, God's voice came. "Tell the people to move forward." Moses turned toward the unmoving water. Forward? There was nowhere to go. But then God spoke again. "Lift your staff over the sea and stretch out your hand." Moses obeyed. And then, the wind began to roar. The people gasped. Before their eyes, the Red Sea split in two. The waters rose up like walls, towering high on both sides. A dry path stretched before them, a road through the sea. For a moment, the Israelites stood frozen, staring at the impossible. Then Moses shouted, "Go! The Lord is with us." The people ran. Mothers carried their children. Fathers gripped their hands. The elderly leaned on staffs. Sheep and cattle rushed forward. And all the while, the water stood like a mighty fortress on both sides. They ran across the seabed, their feet kicking up dry dust where water had once been. Behind them, Pharaoh's army reached the shore. The Egyptian soldiers pulled their reins. "What is this?" Then Pharaoh's face twisted in anger. "After them," he roared. The chariots rolled forward. Soldiers charged down the path between the waves, their eyes locked on the Israelites. The chase was on. As the Egyptians charged into the sea, something strange happened. Their chariots began to shake. Their wheels jammed. Their horses stumbled. The soldiers struggled to move, fear rising in their hearts. "This is the hand of God," one cried. "Turn back," another shouted. But it was too late. On the other side, the last Israelite stepped onto dry land. Moses stood on the shore, watching as the Egyptian army struggled in the middle of the sea. Then God's voice thundered. "Moses, stretch out your hand over the waters." Moses lifted his staff. And then, the walls of water collapsed. The mighty sea rushed back into place, swallowing Pharaoh's army. Chariots tumbled. Soldiers screamed. The waves crashed over them, dragging them into the deep. Not one of them survived. The Israelites stood in stunned silence. The army that had once enslaved them, the king who had once ruled them, all were gone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, from the crowd, a voice shouted in joy. And another. And another. The people cheered. Moses' sister, Miriam, grabbed a tambourine. She began to sing and dance, leading the women in joyful music. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Men, women, and children laughed and danced. They had seen the power of their God. They were free, and this time, Pharaoh would never chase them again. The Red Sea was behind them. Egypt was gone. The people of Israel stood on the sandy shore, gazing at the endless desert ahead. They had seen the mighty hand of God. They had watched him split the sea and crush their enemies beneath the waves. Now, they were free. But freedom came with a challenge. Before them stretched a land of nothingness. No cities, no rivers, no fields of grain. Only sand. Only heat. Only wilderness. And they had to cross it. With their families. With their livestock. With no food and no water. Their journey had just begun. For 3 days, the Israelites walked through the desert of Shur. The sun blazed overhead. Their feet burned on the hot ground. Their throats became dry. There was no water anywhere. Mothers held crying babies. Fathers walked with weary steps. Even the animals staggered in the heat. Then, someone shouted from the front of the crowd. Water! Excitement surged through the people. They rushed forward, their tired feet finding new strength. And there it was, a pool of water. The Israelites ran to the water's edge. Some fell to their knees, scooping it up with their hands. Others filled their jars. But the moment the first sip touched their tongues, they spat it out. The water was bitter, poisoned. It was undrinkable. A groan of despair spread through the crowd. What are we supposed to drink? Someone cried. Why did God bring us here to die? The people turned on Moses. You led us into the wilderness to kill us. First no food, now no water. We were better off in Egypt. Moses looked up to heaven. Lord, what should I do? Then God spoke. Take a piece of wood and throw it into the water. Moses obeyed. He took a branch from a nearby tree and tossed it into the pool. The moment it touched the water, a miracle happened. The bitter water became sweet. The people rushed forward again, this time drinking deeply. Water dripped from their faces. Children splashed and laughed. Relief swept through the camp. God had provided. And he was only getting started. Days passed. The Israelites traveled deeper into the wilderness. The food they brought from Egypt was running out. The bread was gone. The dried meat finished. And the hunger began. Children cried at night. Men searched for wild plants, but there was nothing to find. Then the complaints started. Why did Moses bring us here? Back in Egypt, we had pots of meat. We had bread. Now we're starving. We should have stayed in Egypt. Moses heard them, his heart heavy. Lord, what should I do? These people are hungry. And God answered, I will rain down bread from heaven. Moses turned to the people. Tomorrow morning, you will see the glory of the Lord. That night, the Israelites went to sleep hungry. But when they woke up, everything had changed. As the sun rose over the desert, the people of Israel stepped out of their tents. Then, they gasped. The ground was covered in something white. Thin, small, flaky, like frost. What is this? Someone asked. Moses smiled. This is the bread God has given you. The people bent down and gathered it. Some tasted it. It was sweet, like honey, soft and light. God had fed his people. They called it manna, which means what is it? Every morning, for 40 years, God sent manna from heaven. Every day, the people gathered just enough for one day, except on the 6th day when they collected twice as much so they could rest on the Sabbath. God provided. And he never failed. The Israelites continued their journey. They came to Rephidim, another dry place. No rivers, no streams, no water. And once again, fear gripped the people. Moses, give us water. Moses sighed. Why do you keep testing the Lord? But the people wouldn't listen. Did God bring us here to die? Was Egypt not better than this? Some picked up stones, ready to attack Moses. Moses cried out to God, "Lord, what should I do?" And God answered, "Take your staff, the same staff you used to part the Red Sea. Go to the rock at Horeb. Strike it, and water will come out." Moses obeyed. He raised his staff and struck the rock. Then, water burst out. Fresh, cool water poured from the stone, filling the land like a small river. The people rushed forward, drinking deeply. Once again, God had provided. But the dangers of the wilderness weren't just hunger and thirst. Enemies were watching. One day, as the Israelites rested, warriors approached from the distance. The Amalekites, a cruel, wicked people, came to attack. Panic spread through the camp. "We don't have weapons. We are not soldiers." Moses turned to Joshua, a strong young leader. "Choose men and fight them." Joshua nodded and gathered an army. They would fight. But Moses had a plan. He climbed to the top of a hill with Aaron and Hur beside him. In his hand, he held the staff of God. As the battle raged below, Moses lifted the staff high. And something incredible happened. As long as Moses' hands were raised, the Israelites were winning. But when his arms grew tired and lowered, the Amalekites pushed forward. Moses gritted his teeth. His arms burned. His muscles shook. Aaron and Hur saw him struggling. So they rushed to his side. They brought a large stone for Moses to sit on. Then, they held up his arms. For hours, they supported him, keeping the staff raised toward heaven. And as the sun set, Israel won. The Amalekites were defeated. Victory belonged to the Lord. The Israelites continued their journey, carrying with them the memories of God's power, the Red Sea splitting, water bursting from a rock, bread falling from heaven. But they were about to experience something greater, something no nation had ever seen before. God was going to speak to them, not through a prophet, not through visions, but with his own voice. And the place he chose? Mount Sinai. After 3 months of traveling through the wilderness, the Israelites camped at the foot of a massive mountain. Sinai was a towering, rocky peak, standing alone in the desert like a giant throne. The people pitched their tents around it. They didn't know why God had brought them there, but they were about to find out. Because on the 3rd day, he came. Moses climbed up the mountain, and God spoke to him. "Tell the people to prepare themselves, for in 3 days, I will come down to this mountain. But they must not touch it, for it is holy." Moses hurried down and told the people. They washed their clothes. They purified themselves. Fathers warned their children, "Do not go near the mountain. Do not even touch its base." Then the 3rd day arrived. And the world changed. The ground shook. A mighty storm swirled above the mountain. Dark clouds rolled in, covering the peak in thick darkness. Then, a blast of a trumpet filled the air. The Israelites covered their ears. The sound grew louder and louder. The mountain shook violently. Suddenly, fire erupted from the peak. Flames shot up into the sky. Smoke rose like a furnace, twisting in the air. Then, from the heart of the fire, came a voice. A deep, mighty voice that shook the heavens. The voice of God. And he spoke these words. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol or worship any image. 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. 4. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 5. Honor your father and mother. 6. You shall not murder. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not lie or give false testimony. 10. You shall not covet what belongs to your neighbor." The voice of God himself echoed across the desert. The people fell to the ground in fear. "Moses," they cried, "we cannot bear to hear his voice anymore. You speak to us instead. If we hear him again, we will die." Moses nodded. He turned and walked into the fire. Moses climbed higher and higher, stepping through clouds of smoke and fire. Lightning flashed. The mountain trembled. And there, at the very top, Moses stood before the Almighty God. For 40 days and 40 nights, he remained on the mountain, listening as God gave him laws and commands for Israel. And then, God gave Moses 2 stone tablets. On them, his own hand had written the 10 commandments. But down below, something terrible was happening. The people grew impatient. "Where is Moses?" they grumbled. "Why is he taking so long?" Then someone had an idea. "Let's make our own God." Aaron, Moses' brother, gave in to their demands. He gathered gold jewelry from the people and melted it down. He shaped it into an idol, a golden calf. "This is your God, Israel," Aaron declared. "The one who brought you out of Egypt." The people cheered. They danced. They worshipped the idol. A festival of sin had begun. But at the top of the mountain, God saw everything. "Moses," God said, "go down at once. Your people have turned away from me. They have made an idol. I am ready to destroy them." Moses' heart pounded. He grabbed the stone tablets and rushed down the mountain. As he reached the camp, he froze. The people were laughing, singing, and dancing around the golden calf. They had forgotten God. In anger, Moses lifted the stone tablets and smashed them on the ground. The people stopped. A heavy silence fell over the camp. Moses stormed toward the golden calf. He threw it into the fire, burned it into ashes, then ground it into powder. "You have sinned against God," he thundered. "Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me." The sons of Levi stepped forward. That day, 3,000 idol worshippers were struck down. Moses climbed back up the mountain. "Lord," he pleaded, "forgive them. If not, erase my name from your book." God saw Moses' heart. He had every right to destroy Israel. But instead, he showed mercy. "I will not go with them," God said, "but I will send an angel before them." But Moses begged again. "Lord, if you do not go with us, we will not go." God was pleased with Moses' faith. "I will go with you." Then God gave Moses new stone tablets to replace the ones he had broken. And when Moses came down from the mountain this time, his face shone like the sun. The glory of God was upon him. The Israelites had received God's laws, built his tabernacle, and seen his glory at Mount Sinai. Now, it was time to move forward. Ahead of them lay Canaan, the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The land flowing with milk and honey. The land of their destiny. So the Israelites marched forward, hearts full of hope. But what they didn't know was that a test lay ahead, and their failure would change everything. As they neared Canaan, God spoke to Moses. "Send 12 men, one from each tribe, to explore the land I am giving you." Moses chose 12 leaders and sent them into Canaan. For 40 days, they explored the land. They saw vast green valleys, rivers flowing with sweet water, and trees heavy with fruit. They even cut down a gigantic cluster of grapes, so large that 2 men had to carry it on a pole. But they also saw something else. The Canaanites. Strong warriors. Mighty cities with walls reaching to the sky. And giants, descendants of the Nephilim. Fear crept into their hearts. And when they returned to the Israelite camp, it was time to give their report. The 12 spies stood before the people. Joshua and Caleb stepped forward. "The land is wonderful," Caleb said. "God will give it to us. Let's go and take it." But 10 of the spies shook their heads. "No," they cried. "The cities are too strong. The people are giants. We are like grasshoppers compared to them." Fear spread like fire through the camp. "We cannot go," the people shouted. "We will die. Let's go back to Egypt." Joshua and Caleb pleaded with them. "Do not rebel against the Lord. If he is with us, we will win." But the people picked up stones. They wanted to kill Joshua and Caleb. Suddenly, a blinding light appeared in the sky. God's presence filled the tabernacle. A deep, powerful voice shook the earth. "How long will these people refuse to trust me?" God's voice thundered. "They have seen my miracles, yet they do not believe." Moses fell on his face. "Lord, have mercy," he cried. "Do not destroy them." God answered, I will not destroy them, but they will not enter my land. They will wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies were in Canaan, until this unbelieving generation is gone. Only Joshua and Caleb will enter. The people wept. Some tried to go into Canaan anyway, but they were defeated. Their dream was delayed. Their destiny postponed. And so, the long, painful journey through the wilderness began. As the Israelites wandered, some began to question Moses' leadership. A man named Korah, along with Dathan and Abiram, led a rebellion. Why should Moses and Aaron be in charge? They said. God speaks to all of us. 250 men joined them. Moses looked at them and said, Tomorrow, the Lord will show who belongs to him. The next day, the rebels stood before the tabernacle with their incense burners. Suddenly, the earth split open. With a thunderous roar, the ground beneath Korah, Dathan, and Abiram collapsed. Their tents, their families, everything was swallowed into the earth. Then fire shot down from heaven and burned up the 250 men who had rebelled. A great fear spread through the camp. The people realized, God chooses whom he wills. Years passed. The old generation died. A new generation grew up, stronger, ready for the promised land. But one day, they ran out of water. They complained to Moses, Why did you bring us here to die? Moses cried out to God. And God said, Speak to the rock, and water will flow. But Moses was angry. He turned to the people and shouted, Must we bring water from this rock for you? And instead of speaking, he struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, but God was displeased. Moses, God said, Because you did not trust me enough to honor me before Israel, you will not enter the promised land. Moses' heart sank. He had led these people for decades. But now, his journey would end before the destination. As the Israelites traveled near Edom, they grew impatient. We are tired of this manna, they complained. There is no water. We hate this wilderness. Suddenly, fiery serpents slithered into the camp. Venomous snakes bit the people. Many died in agony. The people ran to Moses, crying, We have sinned. Pray to God to take the snakes away. Moses prayed, and God answered, Make a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Whoever looks at it will live. Moses did as God commanded. And when the dying people looked up at the bronze serpent, they were healed. At last, the Israelites reached the borders of Canaan. The promised land lay before them. Moses led them to Mount Nebo. And there, God showed him the land. Look, Moses, God said. This is the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You will see it, but you will not enter. Moses' eyes filled with tears. He had walked with God for 120 years. He had seen miracles, spoken face to face with the Almighty, and led a nation from slavery to freedom. And now, his journey was over. On that mountain, Moses closed his eyes. And the Bible says, God himself buried him. No one ever found his grave. Moses was gone. But God had chosen a new leader. Joshua, the man who had trusted God when others doubted. The man who had believed in the promised land. And he led them to the promised land. Years passed. Joshua grew old and wise. He gathered the people and spoke his final words. Fear the Lord and serve him faithfully. If you turn away from God, trouble will come upon you. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people shouted, We will serve the Lord. Joshua smiled. His mission was complete. He had led Israel into their destiny. And with that, the great warrior went to be with the Lord. Moses had led them out of Egypt. Joshua had led them into victory. The land was theirs, just as God had promised. But would Israel remain faithful? Would they continue to trust God? Or would history repeat itself? Only time would tell. Moral of the story. The story of Moses teaches us faith, obedience, and perseverance. Even when things seem impossible, God always makes a way. Moses trusted God, even when Pharaoh refused to listen, when the Red Sea blocked their path, and when the Israelites lost faith. His life reminds us that God is always in control. He sees our struggles, He hears our prayers, and He leads us through every challenge, if we trust Him. No matter how big the enemy is, God is always bigger. Before we conclude, let's have this prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the story of Moses, a testimony of your power, love, and faithfulness. Just as you led him through trials and victories, lead us in our own journey. When we face obstacles, remind us that you are the God of miracles, the one who parts the seas, provides in the wilderness, and speaks through the fire. Give us faith to trust you, patience to wait on your timing, and strength to obey your voice. Help us to walk in the purpose you have for us, just as Moses did. We surrender our lives to you. Lead us, protect us, and fill us with your Holy Spirit. In Jesus' mighty name, Amen. If this story blessed you, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more powerful Bible stories and inspiring messages. Click the bell icon so you never miss a new video. Stay connected and grow in faith with us.